Hello beauties, welcome to Avalon Priestess TV. I'm Demi from Rockstar Priestess, and today we're here to talk about the underworld priestesses of Avalon. When we think of Avalon, often we think of spiritual bliss and cloaked sisters, like a more cool pagan version of nuns walking across the sacred landscape in the mist, holding chalices and being lost in prayer and devotion to the goddess, which is beautiful and gorgeous and very, very right on. We love that. But also a really big undercurrent of Avalon is death. We don't like to think about death that much in our world. And even in modern paganism and goddess world, we don't always like to think about death too much. Sometimes there is this edge in paganism and goddess world to kind of whitewash things and keep them happy and light and yummy and delicious all the time, forgetting that if we are really in devotion to the goddess, she is everything. She is the beautiful things, the roses, the hummingbirds, and she is the rotting pigeon at the end of my garden that a cat brought in. Yeah, she is all of life and all of nature. And these underworld priestesses of Avalon would have had a really, really, really big part to play in the service to the goddess, and they do still today. So what would an underworld goddess of Avalon? Firstly, why underworld in Avalon? Avalon has often been referred to as the island of the dead. It is a place where the dead would visit, in some stories, on their journey towards whatever happens after death. It would be a resting place, a fairy land that you would pass through. It is also associated with death in the Arthurian tales. We have our beloved King Arthur, who is a modern manifestation of the ancient sun god of the Celts, who at his death, he never really dies, but at his almost death, he is taken away on a boat across the sea to Avalon by his sister, or just friend, Morgan le Fay. And Avalon has been associated with lots of fairies. Fairy. And in fairy lore, often fairyland is a place where the host of the dead get to party and play. Or in Christian times, it's a place where if you were unbaptized as a baby, instead of getting to go to heaven, you would have to join the fairy raid and spend all your time galloping around the landscape, hanging out with the fairies. And one more really beautiful connection with death in our modern day Avalon, and often in the modern day Avalon is associated with Glastonbury in Somerset, is that underneath Glastonbury Tor, the main hill on the Glastonbury little town, or what would have been a little almost island many centuries ago, that is where the ancient Celtic god Gwyn ap Nudd was supposed to live. And like all ancient Celtic gods, he got kind of demoted into a fairy being. Although I don't think in ancient times fairy would have been a demotion at all. And he is the god of death. He is an underworld god. He guards the entrances to death and to the world beneath, which is where the fairies and all the shadow parts of our world live. So Avalon has always had this really big connection with death. And it's interesting, why wouldn't the priestesses of Avalon also have this big connection with death? And of course they do. In fact, I believe all priestesses do. If we are tending the passage of life, if we're tending the rites of passage, there are two kinds really. There is an initiation into a new part of your life, a birth, if you will, and there's an ending. There is death. And all endings are a death in some way or other. So the role of a priestess, and particularly a role of a priestess of Avalon, is to midwife death in her many forms. Death can come at the end of a marriage. Death can come when your beloved pet is dying and needs to be buried, and you have to feel that big love you've had for them for their whole life. Death can come to us at the end of our lives. Everyone's gonna die, and we need priestesses to hold that. So the role of a priestess of Avalon, I believe, is always very tied up with these service to death and the underworld. And as a priestess, we are helping people to step through these doorways, these passageways, these gates into new parts of life or into out of life. So as a priestess of Avalon, the underworld is always going to be a part of your work. Always, 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 always. And in this, we are inspired by one of the most famous priestesses and goddesses of Avalon, Morgan Le Fay. She was the one who took King Arthur across the sea to the Isle of Avalon for him to rest and heal and live in the myth realms until it's time for him to come back. And in this, she is showing herself as a death priestess. I believe that, like Mary Magdalene, she would have brought her holy oils, perhaps of silver fir and of lavender, definitely lavender, perhaps of oak moss and some precious rose and frankincense that she had imported from the Mediterranean Sea. And she would have anointed King Arthur as she took him across the sea to Avalon. So one of our biggest Avalonian myths is this passage of death. And as an underworld priestess of Avalon, we're here to hold space for that. The priestesses of Avalon are not afraid of the darker parts of life. We are very happy to sit there with them, to look always in that mirror, to be really reflecting and changing and growing ourselves, facing our own shadows and being willing to sit with other people in their dark moments. And as a priestess, we're not sitting with them and trying to fix them and smooth everything away and make things better, because the core art of the priestess is presence. It is to be with, it is to bring presence to something, it is to bring sacred presence to a part of life. And that's what we do with death. We bring our presence, we bring our whole heart, we bring our compassion and our support, so that people stepping through a death gateway, whether that's their own death or a beloved's death or an ending or a grief, we can sit with them in that moment. And we have a whole module on underworld priestessing in my Priestess of Avalon year-long training, which is just for priestesses who really want to get out there and be working as a priestess in the community. And as an underworld priestess in my reimagined school, we learn, of course, the arts of funeral and making ceremonies for funerals and for memorial services, but also we learn about the dying process. We learn about what happens to someone as they die. We learn how to sit with somebody as they are dying, how to death doula. We don't become official death doulas, but we have the skills, so if we ever need it, we can use it. We learn about different kinds of grief and how we can hold ceremonies and create sacred moments so that grief can be processed. Because I believe one of the works of a priestess and of our mission to bring ceremony back into the world is difficult feelings cannot be processed and moved through us if we are repressing them and shoving them down. So a big part of being a priestess is creating these spaces, these sacred spaces, for people to feel and be safe with their feelings and emotions so they can flow through us like water. Yeah. So we learn about grief, we learn about personal grief, we learn about midwifing, change and death in our lives and in the lives of others. And we also learn about big fat existential grief, because we all know too much nowadays, right? Our old priestesses of Avalon back in the day, they wouldn't have had to worry about everything that's happening in Gaza. They wouldn't have had the horrors of Ukraine resting on their consciousness. They wouldn't have had to face the onslaught of grief and collective anguish that we have. So we work with eco-grief a lot in Priestess of Avalon, as our Mother Earth around us dies, shifts, changes through our work as people on this earth, and we create spaces for people to feel that existential grief. And this is the true work of a Priestess of Avalon. We're here to celebrate the most beautiful parts of life and to celebrate the most difficult, to honor them, to create space for them, to allow these feelings and transitions to happen. And that's what they would have done. That's what we would have done thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago. We would have learned these skills and gone out into our communities and been the anchor so that people can feel their feelings, process life, process joy, process death, and see great meaning in all of it. So I hope you have learned a little bit about what it means to be an underworld priestess of Avalon and see how this underworld death rebirth current is woven into the very fabric of the Avalon mythos. If you want to learn more about becoming an underworld priestess of Avalon with me, just send me a message or click the link below to learn more about my programs and all the beautiful free things I have on offer for you. Thank you very much for joining me for Avalon Priestess TV, sending you loads of love.